I'd like to welcome you to tonight's talk. I'm Catherine Harrington. I'm a fifth-year graduate student here at the Joukowsky Institute. Linda Gosner, who is a fourth-year student, and I are co-organizing a Mellon graduate workshop this year called Daily Deeds and Practice Patterns, Approaches to Studying Daily Life and Habitual Practices in the Ancient World. Our group of 10 students from 5 different departments has been meeting every other week to read and discuss articles and workshop dissertation chapters and other student work, and to eat a lot of snacks. We've been joined by several different professors from Brown at our meetings, but tonight is our first public lecture with an invited speaker. We'd like to thank the Mellon Foundation and the Kojic Center for the Humanities for their support of our workshop and this lecture.
So I am very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Scott Hutson. Scott comes to us from the University of Kentucky, where he is an associate professor of anthropology. We're very excited that he's able to be here because his research interests line up very close with those of our group. He studies daily practices and their spatial context, as well as dwelling and identity in the Maya world. He has been doing archaeology in the Maya area since 1996, focusing primarily on the Yucatan. He is currently directing the Uki Kansekab Regional Integration Project, and he has also worked extensively at Tunjukmil, which formed the basis of his book, Dwelling, Identity, and the Maya, Relational Archaeology at Tunjukmil. Tonight he will be delivering a paper called Matter and Mingling Make Ancient Maya Folk Who They Are. So let's welcome Dr. Scott Hutson.
Thank you. Well, is there any way I could get a little bit of a light up here? Oh, that's great. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you so much to Catherine and Linda for inviting me to come here and give this talk, and also to the Joukowsky Institute, but also just for setting up the stay so well. I mean, they picked me up from the airport and taken me all over, and it's just been a real pleasure. So I want to begin with this kind of silly title. It's sort of annoyingly middle brow, the embarrassment of M's, and I had the word sort of make and Maya and matter together, and I thought, well, I'll just go overboard and throw in mingling. And the idea is, when rubberneckers stop at the side of a highway to observe a spectacle of a car crash, I thought maybe I could draw more people into the talk if they saw, oh, what is this Kentuckian coming here with this dumb title? But the words actually, what I'm going to talk about today, despite the title, is actually quite a bit about daily deeds and daily practice. And so I want to start with that word make. And I use the word, when I talk about making people, making ancient Maya, I'm talking about the same sense that a lot of writers have used. People like Pierre Bourdieu, who in his book Distinction, when he talks about class, he doesn't simply refer to a certain position in the circulation of surplus or a certain level of wealth or occupation. He's talking about ways of speaking, habits, dispositions that basically make you classy or not. That's kind of a strange way of putting it. But the same point is pretty fundamental to early studies in gender. In 1949, Simone de Beauvoir famously wrote, "Woman is not born woman, she becomes one." So the point is just that we only become who we are through daily deeds, interactions, practices that help us build up these sometimes embodied habits, ways of speaking. When I talk about daily practices, I'm going to be referring to basically 2 kinds of things. One is matter, the material world. The other is mingling. Mingling is sort of the weak word in the title. But when I use the word matter, I just want to kind of highlight the important role that physical objects, that things play in the formation of the self. So a lot of us unconsciously sometimes go through life with very close interactions with dishware, houses, on an hourly, daily basis. And our interactions and close relations with these material things build in us often unconscious understandings of the world. And these understandings guide our expectations. They cause us to act in certain ways. And so to the extent that matter can kind of help channel our actions, and we can speak of it in some sense as having agency. Now that's a terrible word, and I totally disagree with the idea that material things are like humans, but to the extent that we can say that the material world has some agency, it comes from a very close interrelation with human beings. Mingling is the word that I'm just talking about social interaction, and it just highlights the key role that interactions between people play in the formation of the self. And as important as what somebody does are the questions of where they're doing it, who they're doing it with, who is observing them, who is in the dark, who is ignorant of all this. And so this brings in the importance of space. It's critical it's critical here to know where things are taking place so we can understand who is able to partake of these activities. Finally, the word folk. This is a kind of an oblique nod to an ethnographer by the name of Robert Redfield. For two reasons, I cite this title, just because Redfield worked in the northern Maya lowlands, which is where my work is as well. But I also used the word folk just because Redfield used it to refer to people who are not at the pinnacle of the social hierarchy, and that's most of the kinds of people I'm going to be talking about today, what we might call sort of commoners. So I'm going to actually talk about two case studies. One is from the ruins of Chunchuk-Mil, where I worked until about 2006, and I'm still writing up some of the results. And the other is from near the site of Uki, which is my current project. I'm going to start with Chunchuk-Mil. So research at that site was part of the Pak Bay Regional Economy Program, which was initiated by a guy named Bruce Dolan, and then myself and Tracy Ardren were co-directors at different time periods. We set out to map about 16 square kilometers of this site. Where I have this yellow star is kind of the core, and you can see that these are just modern pueblos nearby, and the land that we intended to map actually falls on the ejido land, or the communally owned land of about 5 different villages. So it was sometimes pretty intense trying to set up all these relationships to be able to get on people's land, and so I want to thank a number of village leaders, and not that these names will mean anything, but it's at least a good chance for you to consume some Yucatec Maya patronyms and matronyms. The site itself, we only got about 9.5 square kilometers of it mapped, which you see sort of right here. On top of that, we were able to get some settlement transects out in some different directions, which add another 2 square kilometers or so to the mapping. And the result is that we can identify basically 3 zones to this site. I'm only going to talk about the site center and the residential core. The site center, about a 0.5 square kilometer. I've got it highlighted here in yellow. It's kind of hard to see what's going on at this scale, so I'm going to switch over to a closer look. But the site is densely enough occupied and sort of busy enough and crowded enough that it's still sort of hard to see what's going on at the site core without some special effects. So there's the special effects. Each of these blue things are temple pyramids, usually about 10 to 17 meters high. The red spaces next to them are sort of plazas that are enclosed by lower buildings. And this is just a photo of, the chronology here. We've put test pits in and around all of them, and most of them date to about the 5th or 6th centuries AD. This is just a photo of about a medium-sized one. This one's about 11 meters high. And so compared to other Maya sites, the buildings at Chunchuk-Mil are kind of puny. So there's a helicopter in that picture. Oh, I've got my laser pointer with me somewhere, don't I? But some of these other sites actually have acropolises and areas where there's a real concentration of large architecture. And Chunchuk-Mil doesn't really have that. Instead, we have a number of nodes kind of around the center, none of which really dominates. Another thing that we lack is hieroglyphic inscriptions on carved monuments. Here's a really good example of one from Copan, Honduras. And what a lot of these carved stone monuments talk about, among other things, are events in the lives of kings. Now, there are some carved stone monuments from a couple of other sites not far away, and the monuments themselves actually date to about the same time when Chunchukmil's leaders were getting their quadrangles, their large pyramids, constructed. And we have some texts on portable items, but just no hieroglyphic inscriptions on monuments. And kind of combined what this lack of a major acropolis and the lack of public monuments proclaiming the deeds of kings suggests that we have a slightly different political organization at Chunchukmil. As opposed to it being a regal ritual center, we think that the main draw to the site was not simply the king and his court and the grandiose performances therein. At the same time, Chunchukmil is just about as big as all these other well-known sites. So I want to move to the residential periphery, residential core, which is also how we're going to get to talk about daily practice quite a bit. The density in this residential core is about 3,000 people per square kilometer, and the site itself, we estimate that it extends for about a total of 15 square kilometers, holding about 35,000 people. Not all those 15 square kilometers have 3,000 people per square kilometer. But to compare to Tikal, the central 16 square kilometers of Tikal holds an estimated 13,000 people. So Chunchukmil is something of a demographic heavyweight. This is just an example of one of these crowded neighborhoods. I'm going to zoom in to a slide that all the people in the workshop saw during lunch, just to give a better sense of what's going on in these crowded residential areas. What we have in yellow are sort of low stone walls that generally encircle some space, in the middle of which is a cluster of buildings. We call these buildings patio groups, usually because it's 3 or 4 houses or other structures surrounding a little patio. Sometimes we just call them groups. And it's basically extended family households that we believe occupy these house lots, which is to say usually 2 to 3 nuclear families and therefore 2 to 3 houses. The buildings themselves usually open out onto the patios. So the patios are a real kind of focus of activities. We think that this is where a lot of crafting may have taken place, eating together, repairing tools, leisure. And so the patios are sort of the node that helps kind of bind together the identity of some of these extended family households. When I talk about these walls, they're not so high as to prevent somebody from looking into a house lot. They're more to just mark boundaries. And this is a blurry photo of one of these low stone walls with no scale. You can just imagine that today they're about this yay high. They would have maybe gone up to waist high in the past. And they're analogous to contemporary Maya villages, which have house lots which are surrounded by stone walls. Now, one interesting thing about the way these honeycomb, these sort of like cells come together is that they do leave here and there kind of parallel pathways, which would have been the main kind of circulation routes for pedestrians throughout the site. This is a reconstruction of what one of those kind of pathways, which is lined on both sides by these low stone walls, reconstruction of what it would have looked like. This is a slide I showed earlier today. You can actually make a kind of a road map of Chunchukmil by linking together all these little pathways. And I'm not going to talk really much about this at all, but it's kind of an exciting map because these stone boundary features, these stone alleyways are very rare at Maya sites. But secondly, they also allow us to actually see where on the landscape people would have been walking. Okay, chronology. We did a lot of test pitting. I set up a kind of a stratified sample of 160 house lots, stratified by area. In other words, we picked at least 10 house lots from each of these square kilometer blocks to at least do some test pits in. And when I say stratified by type of house lot, I just refer to the heterogeneity of these house lots. There are what we call big ones, medium-sized ones, small ones, and some other special ones. And so we came up with a kind of a typology and just made sure that within each square kilometer block, at least one or two examples from each house lot type received some excavation. And so this is just two different square kilometer blocks that show, exactly which house lots ended up being sampled. There's really no big message in it. Oh, you know what? Can people see it when there's, just one second. Oh yeah, okay, everything's working fine, great. Okay, so chronology-wise, we get about the same chronology in the residential areas as we did at the site core, which is to say that most of the people were occupying Chunchukmil around the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries AD, although we do have a little bit of what we call terminal classic occupation and some occupation very light beginning in the late formative. Okay, so to talk about some specific places where daily practices are taking place, I want to take you to this little area of the site where I've done a lot of work on two sort of neighboring house lots. One's named after a turtle, one's named after a frog. These are Yucatec Maya words. This is the topographic map of those two groups. In terms of methods, obviously, we need to do broad-scale excavations of the buildings. So this is an example of some of the so in green, we sort of see some of the aerial excavations. The photo that was the kind of frontispiece of the presentation comes from that structure right there. But a second important method has to do with testing these open spaces. And that's because a lot of activities in the tropics took place outdoors, took place beyond the buildings. And because we knew where the boundaries of each house lot stood, we knew whose land was whose. So we could actually confidently say that stuff that's taking place up to this wall actually pertains to or was generated by people living in these houses. So we did about 100 of these 50 centimeter by 50 centimeter little pits across the open spaces. And finally, because of preservation concerns and because of the fact that sometimes people move their trash from one context to another, we want to look at some smaller residues. So we did a lot of fine screening, some soil chemistry work, a little bit of phytolith analysis. So there's a kind of a bit of I'm just going to kind of present the Ak group as sort of a historical narrative that will kind of culminate in a discussion of where things were taking place and changes in where things took place as a result of some transformations of the group itself. So I'm going to start with structure 23. This is a photo of the building just about when the excavations were complete. It actually began as just a rather small plaster floor, very low to the natural ground surface, probably the first sort of house in this group. Soon after the construction of this floor, the occupants broke through that floor, laid down a kind of a stone cyst, and deposited a pair of burials, probably secondary burials, the way the bones are kind of all piled up in a way. One neat thing about the soil chemistry, looking at, taking samples from across the plaster floor, is that all the readings, all the samples, all the blue spots that are toward the edge of this cyst were high in mercury. So it suggests that they may have sprinkled some cinnabar, a red pigment, which is mercuric sulfide, around the edges of around the burial, and some might have sprinkled over. The burial itself, it was actually quite rich. A lot of jade beads, spondylus shell ornaments. The pots were kind of exciting. This particular one is carved in the round. It also has a very short text, which is very formulaic. It's common in the Maya area. It's basically a name tag. The actual name of the person on there who would have owned this is not deciphered, but we would guess that it's actually a noble from Chunchukmil, which somebody who didn't actually live in this relatively modest group. So actually, to step back a bit, these two groups that I showed you a picture of, the Ak and the Mooch group, they're about in the middle of the pack in terms of the amount of space and the elaboration of the construction of the houses. So we think that this pot actually just suggests some social ties that actually united some kind of middle-of-the-road folks with some rather powerful folks who would have commissioned the pot initially. But eventually, after the burial, the folks built a kind of a square platform, rather high, about a meter high, higher than any of the other platforms in the group. They built it on top of the burial cyst. And what that means is that this, usually in the Maya area, shrines for ancestor veneration are a little higher, and they're also in square. So this area kind of became what we're calling an ancestor shrine. And there were several other modifications to the building, expansions, weird things over the next several generations. But when that first plaster floor, that first house, was turned into a shrine, they built an elaborate house just to the northwest, right here, with sort of stone walls. This is kind of the floor plan of that. It's got a kind of the back room faces, well, the back room is sealed off from the rest of the other two rooms, and you can only get to it from behind the patio, which is kind of interesting. At that time, this area down here, a later structure was eventually built over it, but beneath that later structure we found a lot of spindle whorls for spinning thread, and there are several kind of metates and grinding stones right around there as well. So it's been pretty well documented that women did most of the spinning and weaving among the ancient Maya, and that they also did most of the food preparation. So I've taken the liberty to call this to call this kind of blue area down here a kind of a women's work area. Bad name, but eventually that area was built over with another house, and a new kind of kitchen was built to the north of the patio, kind of blocked off from the patio by by structure 22, which continues to be occupied. So this is a kind of a critical juncture in the sense that the kitchen is being moved off the patio. Insofar as these patios are important areas of socialization and activity within the house lot, what this means is that for at least those times of day, which might have been several hours when women are grinding corn, preparing food, they are kind of cut off both from the kind of the ancestor shrine, the symbolic anchor of the patio group, as well as some things taking place on the patio. So that spatial shift in daily activities, I argue that it kind of reconfigures social relations. But the picture is not complete until we also talk about what else is going on up here, what other new possible social interactions took place. And so here we're going to combine a lot of different lines of evidence, just the accumulations of ceramics across the house lot. These are phosphates, data on the soil depth, to kind of recreate in a schematic view some other points of data about how this house lot was used. So we think that there's some kind of the sort of trash. There are a few trash dumps around here, gardens, which I've put in green here, which I identify on the basis of deeper soils, enriched phosphates, as well as phytoliths of maize. A lot of house lots in the past and today were also places where tree crops were grown. Just a mango tree, this and that. And we found a couple of phytoliths in a couple places that suggest zapote trees growing. And so I don't know if this is the exact location of them, but I think it's a good bet that there was some arboriculture going on in these house lots. Really high iron in a few spaces. It's not clear what this represents. I put the word pigments just because that seems to be the common interpretation of iron hotspots. And I guess this might be discarding some pigments. All the houses were painted in red. A lot of iron is an important component of a lot of red mineral pigments, hematite and whatnot in the Maya area. It could also be possibly, areas where blood was spilled. Finally, work area. So this area actually had nothing in terms of large artifacts. It was just a kind of a very flat space. But in the fine screening, we found a few little chips of obsidian. So that suggests that this might be a kind of an intermediate area near the edge of the house lot where some activities were taking place that were kind of intermediate between inside and outside the house lot. So if women are kind of relegated to the space off the patio, though they may lose out on being able to see what's going on the patio, they actually gain some access to things going on elsewhere in the house lot. And they can also interact with people on the pathways on the north side of the Ak group, something they couldn't have seen when they were down here. They can also potentially interact with people in other house lots. So in sum, this kind of movement of the kitchen at first glance seemed to isolate women when they were preparing food, may in fact have had a very different effect of putting them in better touch with other people doing other things. And thus far, this kind of consideration of gender in daily life isn't really that rich or nuanced, because this group of women that I'm talking about who are spending hours of their day working in these locations is still pretty faceless, kind of homogeneous. What I think is a good inference here is that of these 3 buildings that were houses, that's probably 3 families. So at least, so there are several women who are of the age in which they would be doing work, and there could be that gender identity could be cross-cut by seniority, age, or status. So to try to kind of pull that out a little bit, I wanted to look at the actual placement of the grinding stones around this new kitchen structure. So all 5 of them, when we encountered them, were face up, as opposed to the other 7 from the group in the old area, which were either face down or reincorporated into the later building. And some analogies from a very well-preserved site in El Salvador called Seren also documented spaces where multiple metates were still kind of properly set up and probably being used at the same time. So if we can imagine that at some times of the year, perhaps when preparing food was a bit busier, perhaps before ceremonies, if we can imagine that a couple of women were occupying these metates, one of them that's kind of inside the structure has a rather limited set of possible interactions. They can really only interact directly with somebody who is at grinding stone 1, at least visually. It's a perishable superstructure, so they could probably hear a lot but not see much. On the other hand, somebody working, grinding maize at the first grinding stone could interact with many other people. So my speculation here is that the specific placement of the metates differentiates women in terms of knowledge and access, and this reifies already existing status and age hierarchies. But as I said, this is a perishable structure, and so I think that all of them may have been able to talk with each other and hear each other, if there were times of the year when 4 or 5 or maybe even 3 women were grinding at the same time. And that enables kind of chatting and joking and gossip, which would have permitted the consolidation of a distinct gender identity. Now I'm going to move over to the neighboring group, the Mooch group, for one more example here. This group has ceramics that date chronologically to the same time period as those from the Ak group, but it's a shorter occupation. There's very few architectural modifications in this group. And we think that just by the layout of when I say we, I mean I. I think that by the layout of these stone walls, that it seems like the Mooch group walls were kind of built afterward. They kind of almost budded off the Ak group. So I'm going to proceed under the assumption that the Mooch group postdates the Ak group, though they were probably contemporaneously occupied once the Mooch group was there. What I really want to talk about is the similarities in the main residences of these 2 buildings. So this is just the elaborate residence structure 13 at the Mooch group. Here's that incomplete photo of the east half of the structure 22 at the Ak group. And when we put them side by side, we notice a lot of similarities. First is size. They're almost identical in terms of size. Second is the floor plan, which is also basically identical. Both have a kind of a long room with an entrance to the patio. They both also have a shorter room behind the long room, which is accessible by a break in the wall. They both have a third room, which is not accessible to either of the other rooms unless you exit the building and walk around the front. Another similarity is a niche that is found at ground level, just above the floor, in the central wall, in the very middle, just opposite the entrance. This one, it doesn't show here because I've kind of got the actual stones drawn instead of the outline of the wall at floor here. Construction technique is the same. These are masonry buildings with stone basically up to the roof. The roof itself was thatch, sorry, not thatch, beam and mortar. There's tons of plaster on the top of these. Both of them are built on a kind of a low superstructure, which I've kind of highlighted with some of these stones in gray. So what does this similarity in these two buildings mean? Well, if all of these kind of elaborate kind of residences in Chunchukmil's house lots are like this, it means nothing. But excavations of other kind of chief houses in house lots show that across the other parts of the site, the floor plans are quite different. It seems like a good explanation here for the similarity is that the people in the Mooch house lot fidgeted off from the Ock house lot, which is to say that people who settled the Mooch group probably grew up in the Ock house lot. Some of them probably grew up in structure 22. This kind of, and so I'm going to make the case that there was a very close kind of everyday, non-reflexive interaction between the people who are living in this home and the home itself, created a kind of an architectural sensibility. And when one of these people founded the Mooch group and brought that sensibility with them, they built a new structure which is basically replicates the old structure. So the material world, in this case, a built environment, molded people to the extent that these people built a new building that replicated the first one. Now, if I wanted to be fanciful or chic, maybe even, I would say that it's as if these buildings kind of used humans as their agents of reproduction. But really, what I want to say is that objects are not agents in that way. It's just that people's daily interactions with the material world can shape those people and their future actions. It's the way that matter is bound up with humans in everyday life that kind of gives some agencies to these buildings. So the last example I want to give comes from my current project. I'll show you a map in a second. But here, I'm also going to talk about close interactions between people and materials, specifically containers used for serving food. In this particular area, as I'm about to show, a lot of the house lots didn't have a lot of ceramic pots. And so I'm going to argue that soft technologies, perishable containers like baskets and gourds, played an important role, and that this has some consequences for social dynamics in the area. So just to zoom in, Uki has a causeway that runs 18 kilometers long, connecting it to Kansakab. My project focuses on both of those sites, as well as a lot of settlements in between. There are several other long-distance causeway systems in the Yucatan Peninsula. Here's a photo of what some of these causeways look like. They're built of stone. They're about usually between 5 and 10 meters wide, and usually between about 50 centimeters and a meter high. So they certainly don't kind of tower over the landscape in any way, but it still would have required a lot of labor to build. Just the fact that they're long. In some cases, they're 100 kilometers long. This is just a quick kind of topographic map of a portion of the causeway between Uki and Kansakab. It's about a 400-meter segment, and just looking at that in 3 dimensions. What are these things for? Well, they don't seem to be about just helping people get from one place to another, because they're overbuilt for that. You don't need, with no livestock, you don't need a 10-meter wide platform to go from one place to another. In some parts of the Maya world, during the rainy season, things get really wet, and there are examples of some of these long causeways that cross over wetlands and would keep a person dry when getting from point A to point B. But we don't have those kinds of wetlands around Uki, so there was no reason for it to be built up 75 centimeters off the ground. The quickest, today when people walk from a village to another, they just use without any trouble, they just use little paths that are not built at all. So the project that I run is trying to understand why this thing was built. We basically think it's a political symbol. It has to do with alliances between sites. But I'm not going to talk much about that. I want to instead kind of talk about some of the household archaeology we've been doing as part of the project. In particular, I'm going to look at two sites, one called Cancab, one called 21 de Abril, April 21st. That's the day that the current ranch owner received title to the ranch. And so I said, hey, you've got a ruin on your land. You want to give it a name? And they're like, oh, how about 21 de Abril? And I was like, oh my God, that's a terrible name. But I don't want to. I want to be respectful. So, just to give some context, this is Uki is sort of the main capital, is the sort of the center for this polity, as I'll call it. The site maybe had 5,000 people, somewhere between the maybe 200 and 400 AD. It has some large architecture. This is a photo of a couple of its monumental complexes. Right behind it is the modern pueblo of Uki. We were able to map a chunk of this. So there's the pueblo. Here's more or less the site core. Able to map a chunk of it with a total station, and so you can kind of see that it does have some monumental complexes. When we get out to 21 de Abril and Cancab, these sites are much smaller. So Cancab is maybe kind of what you might call a minor center. It has perhaps 1,000 people living there. Here's sort of some boundaries, suggested boundaries for where the kind of site edges might be. I want to look at some excavations around structure 51 up there. And the buildings, the platforms in most of this area are called megalithic, and they get that name because of the rather large blocks that are used to build the retaining walls of the platforms. That particular photo is taken sort of, well, the camera was at the end of this arrow kind of pointing this way. So that's that particular wall there. So structure 51 is a medium-sized platform that has a couple of other structures around it. This is just the topography there. And we did that same technique of 50 centimeter by 50 centimeter pits at the corners of a 5 meter by 5 meter grid. So this is where those pits ended up occurring. And this is the results of just the ceramics. In total, this represents about 10 cubic meters of excavation, and we found 178 grams of pottery. Very little, very little. Compared to, here's a similar map from Chunchukmil, where we have 20 times the amount of ceramics. The highest density here is 10 kilograms per cubic meter. The highest density here is 0.5 kilograms per cubic meter. And so this was a little early on in the project, and we started wondering where are all the ceramics? Oh, well, it must be because there was a real short occupation here. Or it must be because they're dumping their trash much further away. Or maybe they dumped the trash on top of the platform and we just haven't excavated there yet. So working at some other places where we had a chance to do more excavation, we began to try to test this question of, we'll test some of these possible explanations for where all the pottery was. So I'm going to slip back to April 21st and look at that site for just a minute. This is, I don't know if you can really call it a site. It's a kind of a truly rural hamlet, a few platforms. We've since surveyed to the north and to the south of this kind of survey transect. This is the causeway in the middle, and found that there's almost continuous settlement around here. So it's actually hard to say what belongs to what site, or if the concept of site is even useful in this area. But some excavations here at Operation 6 helped us test to some degree some of these expectations for alternative hypotheses of where the ceramics are. There's just a kind of a topo map. So one thing was maybe they threw their trash further out from the house lots. I mean, we were only putting these pits up to about 15, 20 meters in every direction. So here we did 300 of these little pits. Took a long time, got up to 70 meters beyond the buildings, and still, the trash still clusters near the platforms, and there was still very little of it. There were, I think, 250 grams of pottery in all these excavations. Another important thing we were able to test with this group is chronology. So we were able to get some excavations of 2 of the platforms, and the main platform has 3 different modifications to it, and the ceramics from that platform actually span a good 500 years. I don't think it was occupied continuously for 500 years, but the fact that somebody took the trouble to build this kind of large platform, it's about 14 by 14 meters, with some of those nice blocks, those megalithic stones, and then modify that platform twice, suggests that they were there for more than just a couple of years. I don't think these excavations provide a good judgment of whether they were dumping their trash on top of the platform, but over here in Operation 1, about 300 meters to the west, we were able to test that. Here's another, just a photo of one of these small structures. It too is megalithic, though we only have kind of one course of megalithic stones. That structure right here is this little one right there, so the camera's facing this way. There's the topography. Here's the excavations. So we made sure to blanket this platform and a couple of the others, and found a grand total on top of the platform in over 100 square meters of excavation, over 40 cubic meters. We found a grand total of about 2 kilograms of sherds. So I think that we've got this position that maybe the people who lived here used less pottery than elsewhere and maybe more perishable containers is supported. I think we can make that argument. But because of poor preservation, we haven't actually found any residues of baskets or gourds. Is there reason to think that that might be a plausible solution? Definitely. So basketry has preserved in contexts where it would be where it would expect to preserve, such as perennially wet sinkholes like this cenote at Chichen Itza. Basketry is also portrayed somewhat commonly in painted pots from the Maya world. Those painted pots are usually palace scenes. So if we want to talk more about the folk, the kind of the more the less wealthy people, we do have a good line on that artistically. So this is a mural from a structure at Calakmul, and it shows a lot of kind of humdrum, kind of hoi polloi, but kind of regular folks, probably at a market selling stuff. And it shows that here's a well, they don't. The glyphs that say like this is the atole person or this is the pot person. So we're not sure that they're selling, but that's one possible interpretation. But I bring up this art just to show that there's a lot of basketry depicted in these scenes, these non-palace scenes, and even the hat is probably pleated. That's probably a kind of a basket-like hat. And this is something that Steve Hutson kind of turned me on to, that there are a lot of pots that were made to look like baskets. Steve uses the word skeuomorphs to talk about these. So we haven't found any baskets, but I think it's likely that basketry was a common material category, material culture in this area. In terms of gourds, the Maya and Yucatan have been using gourds at least throughout the historically documented periods, and still use them today for a variety of things, for fetching water, for storing water, for keeping tortillas warm, they use them as thermoses to bring water out into the field when they're farming. What about in ancient times? Well, there's a real famous depiction of a gourd at a site called San Bartolo, and there are also gourd pots made to look like gourds. This kind of double-barreled gourd depicted on the murals at San Bartolo is Lagenaria siceraria. It's that you can see a kind of a contemporary, well, actual example of that double-barreled species of plant that the species of plant that produces the double-barreled gourds. And so here's a ceramic pot made to look like a gourd, and there's several other examples of pots made to look like gourds. And there have been, actual fragments of gourds found in places where they might likely to be preserved. Suren in El Salvador, which was a Pompeii-like site, has gourd fragments, and Tombs of Rio Azul has gourd as well. There's an argument out there that the first Maya pottery, or some of the first pottery in Mesoamerica, was made to look like gourds, suggesting that before they had pottery, they had gourds and baskets. And you can do just about anything with gourds and baskets as you can do with pots. The one thing you can't really do is put a gourd over fire. But you can still cook with gourds by heating up rocks on a fire and putting those rocks into a stew inside the gourd, and that can cook your stew. Where am I now? Whoopsie. So I want to talk about how the use of gourds and baskets on a daily basis shaped embodied expectations of the world. So sensibilities and sensitivities gained from frequent contact with these perishable materials, these lightweight gourds and baskets, as opposed to the sensibilities that come from handling pottery, eating out of pottery, serving food out of heavy pottery. These sensibilities produces a person with particular dispositions, understandings, and expectations, many of which are non-discursive. So the question becomes, how do the sensory experiences of pottery versus perishables differ, and what are the consequences of these different experiences? As I mentioned before, baskets, gourds are both a lot lighter than pots. We can talk about fragility. When you drop a basket, nothing happens. When you drop a pot, it smashes. There's a certain flexibility and affordance in these perishable materials that's not in the pots themselves. And so I'm going to argue that baskets and gourds cultivate a kind of a different way of carrying the self. You can be less physically careful around baskets, for example. And when I say around baskets, people really were around them. I mean, to the degree that mats are kind of a form of basketry, kind of woven reeds, to the degree that sandals and hats are also kind of a form of basketry. There's an actual intimate kind of relationship with, I don't know if intimate relationship with baskets is the right way, but there's a kind of a sense of close, maybe you get my, what's that? Point taken. Okay. So what? Why does this matter? Well, at 21 de Abril, there is one platform that we've excavated down here that actually has an abundance of pottery. This is the largest platform in this community, both by surface area and by volume. It's the highest platform. A lot of the pottery, a much higher proportion of that pottery is decorated serviceware. We're talking about bichromes and polychrome bowls, plates. And a lot of Maya archaeologists have been talking about buildings like this in small communities that are much bigger than the rest of the buildings in the community and that seem to be facilities for feeding others, kind of locales for feasting. So if we have a situation where people who are coming from households who are much more attuned to, or who eat much more regularly out of gourds or serve themselves with baskets, come to this platform for a harvest ceremony or something, and they immediately have to walk up to the top of the platform, which is much bigger than their own platform, and they begin to drink their served food in pottery, which is a lot heavier as you hold it up to your mouth. They can be kind of reminded at an embodied, at a very subtle level of social distinctions. It's a lot cheaper to make a container out of a gourd than it is to make one out of pottery. And so to the extent that these less wealthy households that have a lot more, that I propose have a lot more perishable containers than ceramics, to the extent that these less wealthy households are more accustomed to gourds and baskets. Sorry, my sentence is not going the right way here. So I just meant to say that when people from these households To the extent that households with a lot more gourds and perishable containers are less wealthy than, for example, this kind of key household at the site, they'll be reminded of that difference when they show up at that household for a kind of a feast. So this is a kind of the different feel of pots versus perishable containers could have created and expressed social status in a very tactile way, bringing the reality of social inequalities into the open. So I think I'm going to wrap up here. Just a couple final statements. I know I've been speaking a bit speculatively, but I thought it would be more interesting to talk about these daily relationships with materials than to talk about new settlement pattern data from this area, at least in terms of daily life. But as many people have argued, the material culture of our daily lives shapes people, imprinting them with dispositions, orientations, and a taken for granted sense of the proper way to live. I'm just trying to make the point that these dispositions cultivated in a household where soft containers predominate are not the same as those dispositions cultivated in a household where hard containers predominate. And I can argue here that the variance in these dispositions became important in situations where households with a different access to pottery came into contact. So I'm just trying to make the point that taking a close look at the kinds of interactions that people have with each other as well as with material goods shape, in a sense, who those people are. And attending to how this network of people and things produces and reproduces itself is at the core of a social archaeology, and I argue that it opens up useful approaches to things like memory, community, identity, and materiality, among other things. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks so much for that really interesting talk. I thought we'd just open it up to questions right away.
Yeah, Andy.
So, I mean, one of the things that always fascinates me about the northern stuff is you've got these communities like Joukowsky that have these walls. And so, I mean, I'm wondering, I mean, first of all, if you can just tell me, do they date to the foundation of these settlements, or when did the walls that go up around the house groups, do you have any sense of when they're in place? And at the same time, do you have the walls at places that you suggest might be more like the regal center, like Oshkintok or Siho? And then the other issue is do you see that as a sort of an outcome of the settlement density, and why, for example, do you have that settlement density, whereas here you don't have that density, nor do you have those walls? And then bringing it back to the question of your talk, which is about mingling in general. I mean, what do you think about the sort of what happens in your daily life in a place like Joukowsky, where everything is sort of walled and contained versus a place like this? And it's always striking to me because in the southern lowlands we don't have these walled house groups like that.
Right, okay. So the first part of the question was the dating of the walls. And the walls we've put a couple trenches across them, but they're usually not affiliated with much ceramic. These little house lot walls, they don't cross over buildings, so you can't get a kind of a terminus post quem for them. But I think I'm on solid ground, if not easily defensible ground, to say that they date to when the households were occupied, because they really circle those households. I don't think they don't make sense as kind of historic corrals. The way that they run is so well keyed to the built environment that we presume that the dating of the buildings is probably when the walls were built. At a very local level, I think we can talk about some walls being built after others, just in the patterns in which the walls intersect and cross over each other. But I think we just have to kind of take it as an article of faith that these things were built when the people were occupying them. So the second question was about density at the site. Do the walls relate to the high settlement density? And I think that yes, in part they do. At other sites, you mentioned regal ritual centers like Oshkintok and Siho. These kind of boundary walls are rare. At Zibil Chaltun, another site in northern Yucatan that has a decently high population density, there are house lot walls, but they didn't map them. And so the extent of them is not like at Chunchukmildo. They're not, there's just fragments here and there. They're not complete. Mayapan is the only other really good example. Well, Bekan has some of these, but Mayapan is a post-classic, sort of the post-classic kind of capital of Yucatan, and it's very densely occupied. They have about 10,000 people within 4 square kilometers. So, and that's the one other site where we have house lot walls all over the place. Basically, almost every patio group is encircled. So I think that there is something that there is a relationship with density, but at a place like El Peru Huaca or Palenque or the central 0.6 km squared in Copan, where you have even higher densities, you don't have these walls. So I can't explain exactly why the walls exist. I think kind of setting up boundaries is important, but why set them up here at Chunchukmil and not in another place? Possibly because a good part of Chunchukmil's economy is a market economy, and which means that there would be more people coming from elsewhere to exchange things at the market. So it could be a statement of boundaries to outsiders. That's about all I can say about the why of the walls. And the third part of your question, I can't remember.
You were just getting at it. I mean, basically, is there something, does this actually say something about the nature of the social fabric of these communities as opposed to what you're seeing here? I mean, thinking beyond.
Good walls make good neighbors.
Yeah, or do they make bad neighbors, or why do some of these places
Right.
have walls?
So, one thing that I've written before is that this is a very agriculturally marginal region. This is the part of the Maya world that gets the least amount of rainfall. The groundwater has salts in it they're just fine for drinking, but aren't that productive for growing crops. So pot irrigation is not going to be as successful. And so one thing that we have documented in several house lots are these house lot gardens. And obviously these gardens are not going to provide any large portion of the subsistence of these houses. We think that they're making use of local resources such as the massive salt flats nearby and actually trading that salt and other commodities inland where there is better land for food. But to the extent that these house lots actually have valuably enriched soil plots for gardens, that might be one reason why a household might want to kind of delineate whose land is whose. And the other explanation just to recap, the other explanation I gave just about 60 seconds ago was if there are more kind of out-of-towners passing through the site, it might be a clear statement of, this is the public walkway and this is my yard, keep out. But I think that, as I was talking about at lunch today, I think that there's actually quite good reasoning to argue that the people who lived in these, about neighbors, that's one of your questions. Are there good relationships between neighbors? I think there's good reason to suggest that people who lived near each other actually were on just as good a terms as people who, as neighbors who didn't build walls. And that's because the road map, which I showed, shows that the roads don't go in all directions. They're more patterned. And so some of the same people are going to be seeing each other over and over again, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be friends, but some of them at least have to work together because some of the walls are shared between house lots. So there's some degree of cooperation and face-to-face social interaction while they're out on the streets. Yeah, Fotini.
So I wanted to ask in this slide, how do you know that these households interact? Because if I understood you correctly, the two in the pink that don't have pottery, you assume that somehow they're invited in this other house, in this, and then they use pottery.
Yeah.
So how do you arrive to this conclusion? Because there you're supposing that kind of connection, drawing arrows coming to this house. So
Right.
how do you know this?
I don't. So I'm just basing off a lot of work that's been going on in other parts of the Maya area. Jason Yeager has done some good work on this, where he's making an argument that in a small community where he worked, there is a kind of a large platform that is comparatively bigger than the rest of them, and there's a lot of good lines of evidence for feasting at that platform. And because the community he's looking at is kind of a rural community, because that large platform that he's looking at is kind of embedded in a cluster of other smaller platforms, it seems logical to say that the people who were coming to this house lot for commensal politics, for feasts, came from right around there. But I think it's a good question, because I think we can also talk about how some of these nodes in these smaller communities may have also been nodes of more centralized recruitment, in the sense that leaders from Uki could come to this house lot and say, hey, can you help us get together a work team among that community? We'll give you some nice pots in return. So I think that there could be two kinds of interactions going on. Interactions that are kind of communal based with other people nearby, and also much more kind of diacritical, kind of vertical based interactions between the center and the rural area. But yeah, I admit that some of this is speculative. We don't know exactly who came to share meals at this household.
Because you still arrive, even if you can't prove that, you can still arrive at the same conclusion because of the architecture, because it's so different and you have such a bigger plaza. So already it's making a social distinction from everybody else by the visual effect of architecture. But I was wondering, how else can you explore that relationship between the different households?
Yeah. I think it'd be, in terms of what line of evidence could show that people from these two households were taking occasional meals over here, like maybe once a year or something like that. I can't think of how to do it. Yeah, we really are kind of speculating here, but I feel comfortable in that speculation.
I actually have a related question. How do we know that a nice pot is better than a nice basket? Is that ethnographic analogy, or? Well,
I'm not sure. I didn't mean to imply that a basket was better.
Or more highly valued, or?
Well, in terms of serving food, it'd probably be comparing gourds versus pottery. And I make the distinction that households with lots of pottery had more resources than ones with less pottery, in part because this household with lots of pottery has more control of labor to build a bigger platform. So they've got that advantage to begin with. But it takes a certain amount of skill and trial and error to successfully make pots, whereas gourds come preformed and they're already dry, and all you have to do is pull them off the branch and cut them open. And there so it's much easier to come by gourds than ceramics. So it's partly an issue of scarcity and partly the association of abundant amounts of pottery with the much larger, kind of more wealthy platform. Yeah?
I'm curious about the iron residues you mentioned. You said they could be either pigments or they could be remains of blood. And I sort of have two questions. One, do you have any kind of faunal data or diet information to be able to tell whether or not they're food related? And if so, are these residues sort of spread evenly across the various house groups? Or could you maybe connect them to sites that are more central to feasting events?
So the first question is about what is the faunal sample? And unfortunately, it's nil. For some reason, human bones preserve underneath floors, but we have no animal bones. I mean, they're just not preserved. So it's a poor area for preservation, because everything is, unless it's buried by a structure. So I should have mentioned that the bedrock on average is 30 centimeters below the natural land surface. And so there's a lot of bioturbation, so if something that's buried at one point could be kicked back up, and if it's not covered over by a floor, it's going to decompose. The question about, how do these, so that's why it's hard to say just what these iron hotspots are. There was a kind of so Steve's project at Piedras Negras is one of the kind of pioneers here. He brought down a team to look at some of the distributions of trace metals. And initially, as I mentioned at the seminar, it was, I think, rather inexact. These were kind of plant agronomists who were talking about how finding a manganese concentration, I mentioned this already today, indicates the use of pyrolusite pigment, which is a pigment that the Maya didn't use. So initially when people were talking about all these different suites of heavy metals, manganese, zinc, iron, I think some of it was hogwash. But other parts of it, like iron, seems to have maybe a better connection to what ancient Maya might have been doing, at least with pigments. Now, another question that you had was about the distribution of iron in other house lots. And so we did do trace metals analysis of the house lot just to the north of the one where I showed those hot spots of iron. And there, I can't remember. I don't think there was as any spots that had quite as much iron. There was a third house lot at Joukowsky where the trace metals were analyzed, and I don't think there were really many clear patterns. But I don't think that those iron hotspots were part of the natural soils there. The soils are rich in iron, but that patterning, wouldn't be able to explain why just in the natural weathering of bedrock, one spot, these three spots would have a lot of iron and other parts weren't. So it's not a very satisfactory answer to your question, and I wish I could say more, but I can't.
All right, I think we should probably wrap it up, but we've got
Okay.
some.
Sure.
Do we have one more question?
Yeah, sure.
I want to know, but we can do it over a drink. That wonderful population density column effect that looks like Harris lines or something like that.
Oh.
I thought that was very effective. I don't. Maybe it was just me.
Is that this slide?
Do miners do that all the time?
This?
Yeah, that. No, I kind of like that. Yeah.
So I didn't actually show this slide. This is just kind of an extra in there, but
I just like. All right, never mind.
I haven't seen it myself. I just thought like that's a neat way to represent sort of one of the peak periods, like the darker areas are when there's more people and the lighter areas are.
I think that we have to kind of rethink how do we visualize something that is, if you don't have numbers or pie charts or column, but I thought
It's a bit. Well, thank you. I think it's a bit more realistic than chopping up than this thing, which kind of chops up the pyramids and assumes that there are sharp breaks in occupation. So that's what I was trying to communicate with this thing, that there are kind of curves and trends as opposed to, yeah.
All right, well, let's thank Scott one more time and we can talk about that.